Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. It's great to have you here. As you hopefully know, this is the KBE Insider program, where we try to get a sense of what's going on in the Kubernetes community going forward. And apologies on apparently my video is a little laggy today, but maybe I look better fuzzy. Who knows? So I'm Langdon White, formerly of Red Hat, now a university professor at Boston University, talking mostly about data science and computing, and trying to open up our world to kind of people who are generally underrepresented or underserved in the tech community as a primary goal. So with that, I'd like to introduce Josh Berkus, my co-host for the show, and then we'll introduce our guest.
Yep. Hi, I'm Josh Berkus. I'm at Red Hat's open source practice office, where I work on Kubernetes and some other related cloud native projects. And in that role, I have been on many video calls with today's guest, Liz Rice, mostly in her capacity as chair of the CNCF or the CNCF Technical Organizing Committee. But there were many reasons why we wanted Liz on the show, not just because of her role in the CNCF, but also because she is a container security expert, which is what we were talking to her about on Tuesday when we lost the stream. So welcome, Liz.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me again.
Yes. So when the stream dropped on Tuesday, we were talking about eBPF. Which is what you're working on now at Isovalent.
Correct.
And particularly, we're talking about how is the isolation that eBPF provides different from isolation that people might be used to from, say, virtual machines?
Yeah, so I think sometimes this can be quite confusing because people talk about eBPF as a sandboxing technology, and people talk about containers as sandboxing or isolation technology. And it's true in both cases, but they're really quite different, and they're sandboxing for very different reasons. So when we talk about containers, we're talking about isolating our application code and stopping our applications from kind of stepping all over each other. With eBPF, what we're doing is running custom code inside the kernel. And you can have multiple different eBPF programs inside the kernel at once. But that sandboxing is more to do with making sure that those programs are safe. I mean, I suppose it's similar. In both cases, we're trying to say these programs have to be safe and not interfere with each other. But in the case of containers, they don't have any awareness of each other at all. When we're talking about the kernel, this is much more about extending functionality inside the kernel and running bespoke capabilities within the kernel and doing that safely.
Okay. But I guess my question is, okay, say I'm running current kernel or maybe future kernel, because I know that eBPF features are still under development. And, I get used to Cilium and a whole bunch of other eBPF tools and that sort of thing. Can I isolate a process running in one container as much as it would have been isolated by virtualization technology, assuming I flip all the switches, right? Because that's always right. The concern with containers running in the same machine, right, is that it's not that same level of virtualization out of the box, of isolation out of the box, right?
Yeah.
They can effectively exchange kernel calls.
Yeah. So when we talk about a host machine, if we're talking about a virtual machine or a bare metal machine, it's got a kernel, and there's only one kernel. However many containers we're running, they're all sharing that same kernel, which is very different from what we, the virtualization world, where each virtual machine running on a physical machine's got its own kernel. So the isolation is very different. And in the container world, that shared kernel it is kind of the reason why some of the kind of old school security issues, I'm saying old school, like, 2 years ago, security issues would
Ancient,
exist
ancient.
because, there's a shared kernel, there's a shared root, root in a container is root on the host.
I would say it is old school, having once upon a time worked on VMS systems. So some of the security problems are very similar, at least in outline.
Although I think VMS is the only operating system I think that never had a virus. There's like some legend of that, but it's kind of like why doesn't Linux get all that many viruses? Because the attack surface might not be that bad, but there's not that much value to writing, viruses.
It's a lot harder to infect something with a virus when it has to be hand carried there on mag tape.
Exactly. Right. But yeah, we're seeing, I don't know, it's a lot of that kind of throwback thing, right? Is that, in a lot of ways, containers are very, very similar to the mainframe, so it's really kind of amusing when we just kind of, it's in tech, we seem to kind of go full circle on the regular, right? And but it gets easier and cleaner and, a little bit more efficient and things like that. But we kind of keep reinventing a thing, and it's all this brand new excitement. But in
Definitely.
fact,
The concepts are the same.
Right. At the end of the day.
My very first job after university was doing like SNA emulation, sort of simulating all these like 3270 and even punch card. Like we were emulating that on what was then Unix, different Unix systems. So it's kind of, I've never actually worked with a mainframe, but I had a lot of experience many years ago with like those SNA protocols, and
my exposure was wrapping them so they could be called from Java, not versus like actually doing anything with the mainframe per se, right?
Right.
It is very interesting. But kind of going back to eBPF, you're talking about there's only one kernel, right? And I think we talked about a little in our podcast there, root has been kind of broken up into these multiple roles. And then, so you have what they call
capabilities.
Capabilities. I was like, compliance? No, that's not the right word. But they have, different capabilities now that you can allocate. And I think eBPF is kind of more in the same vein of like, you can kind of say, okay, now we can, we can sandbox these things, and we can separate them off from each other, thereby making the overall system almost more multi-tenant as much as more safe,
That is true. I mean, capabilities allow you to be more fine-grained about who has which different permissions. But I think once we get into the world of BPF, there is a BPF capability. So if you have cat sysadmin, that includes cat BPF, but you could have that smaller surface just have permission to load BPF programs without having all the other sysadmin privileges. But once you've loaded that program, and if it is safe to run and it passes the verification and it's not trying to stamp over the wrong kind of memory or anything like that, if it's safe, then that BPF program can be basically all powerful. It can see, so we attach BPF programs to events. An event might be a network packet arriving, or a particular function call inside the kernel code, or a trace point, or even user space functions we can attach to. And it really doesn't matter what it is that triggers that event. It doesn't matter which application, it doesn't matter which process it is. If that event gets triggered, that BPF program is going to run. So it gives us this very powerful tool for knowing what's happening in a system. If you want to write an observability tool, BPF is incredible, because you attach that BPF program to the event you want to observe, and you see it not just for new processes, not just for new for everything that starts calling it, your BPF program can be triggered. Incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But from a security perspective, that does mean you can't just let anybody run BPF programs willy-nilly all over your systems. That would be pretty scary.
Right. I mean, as you were saying, I think last time we talked, that, part of the challenge now is that security profiles, right? Is that, is kind of doing those correctly. and that's still kind of challenging.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of usability problem for security, whatever kind of security we're talking about. Anything from, I don't know, dependency scanning to runtime security to seccomp profiles to anything we're talking about. It seems like right now you have to have kind of domain specific knowledge to know how to build that profile. And I anticipate over the next few years, we'll see much more in the way of helping people build sane but powerful profiles. I mean, there are some good examples of this, like the Docker seccomp profile was a very good basis for an all-purpose or general purpose security profile for seccomp. If you want a more fine-grained seccomp tool, that we're seeing a few things being developed with eBPF that can check what system calls your application uses, and you could use that to build a more bespoke seccomp profile. But as an application developer, do you really want to have to know what seccomp is?
Right. Exactly.
If you're a Java programmer, why should you care? So we need to make that much easier as an industry.
Right. I mean, this is one of those things where it's also, it's very hard for a developer to be an expert in everything, right? And so, if you're, an expert in, Java threading or whatever, it doesn't mean you're also an expert in, seccomp, right? I mean, it's not, and it doesn't make you good, bad, or indifferent, as a programmer. It's just that, that's kind of where your expertise landed. And so if we can, it's almost like separation of concerns, right? It's like if you can kind of say, okay, this person knows this part, right? And we can have them work on this particular piece, then, even if they're all, equally capable programmers or whatever, you don't have to have, learned everything in the entire world. Which is very difficult.
Yes. And when I say Java programmers, that was just, an example.
Yeah.
As you say, everybody has specialist knowledge, and we shouldn't be expecting everybody to get specialist knowledge in every area.
Right. Yeah. I mean, going back to the kind of the old school, right, is like, in the old days, I used to have to be able to change a hard drive and, and program and, everything else. But I think it's kind of like the space that we, live in, right? That we live in now is so vast that you can't be kind of a complete, Renaissance man, for lack of a better term, where you kind of just know everything. It's nearly impossible.
Totally. It's like, nobody, just because you work in tech doesn't mean you can do like IT support for your family.
Printers, for example, right? Is there anybody who can do
family that?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Particularly when they keep wanting help with their Windows machines, and I'm like, I don't know. I haven't used it since Windows 2000.
Yeah. I was trying to explain in a class the other day because I know it exists on Windows, where etc hosts file is, right? And I was like, and then I was walking away from the lecture, and I was like, oh, I remember, it's in C:system drivers, and that's where it is, but I haven't touched it in, I don't know, 10, 15 years. So I have no idea for sure. But yeah, interesting. So let's see. Should we talk about Cilium a little bit? If you could tell us a little bit more about what that project is doing.
Yeah. So Cilium has been around as a project for, I want to say since, 2015, 2016, something around then. And the people who created it, really, they're pioneering in eBPF at the same time. There's a lot of overlap between people who are developing eBPF in the kernel and the Cilium maintainers. And Cilium is really about really efficient eBPF-based networking, which primarily we talk about it in a cloud native context. We talk about it as a Kubernetes CNI, a networking plugin. You can actually use it outside of the context of Kubernetes as well, but certainly the majority of users, I would say, are using it in the world of Kubernetes. And I talked earlier about how we attach eBPF programs to events, and that can be network packets. It could be packets arriving at a network interface. It can be packets at just coming out of an application at the socket layer. And with eBPF, we can essentially hook into those kind of extreme ends of the networking stack and be much more efficient about how we connect packets from one pod or one container to whatever destination it's going to, or vice versa. And we can also, as a Kubernetes CNI, have all this identity information about what is the pod and what service is that pod part of, and use that to build up connectivity information that is meaningful. Normal or sort of, traditional networking talks about, IP addresses and ports, but in a cloud native world, that's kind of impossible to keep track of because pods are ephemeral and IP addresses come and go. You want, as a human, certainly, you want to see networking flows and debugging information in some form that talks about pods, and that's something that we do with Cilium. So as well as having the connectivity, we have some observability tools in a component called Hubble, and we're increasingly looking at how we can use that for security purposes, and we have network security profiles. There's really interesting things we because we have this visibility into not just, here's a network connection that's been opened, but we can see, well, what was the process that opened that connection, and what's the executable, and what's the destination, and is this executable a cryptocurrency miner, and is it supposed to be accessing that pool over there? Getting that kind of intelligence and being able to act on that in real time is, I think, it's why I got involved in Cilium, because it's the future of security as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of interesting points there, right? Like one of them is kind of that Etsy host remark I just made, right? Is I was trying to teach a group of student developers kind of the base version of what you need to know about DNS as a developer, right? And because
it's always DNS, that's the first.
Yeah, it's always DNS,
Yep.
right? It's either DNS or printer. But with the DNS, right, it's like you can kind of know a bit about how it works and not really need to, be deep into the networking to kind of get by as a developer. And I just, kind of in the back of my mind while I was talking about it, I was like, and wait till you get to Kubernetes and containers and that kind of stuff. And it's just going to blow your mind, right? Because now you got IP addresses floating all over the place. And, because all the different services are trying to talk to each other and all these things. So I think anything that's kind of letting you think about the application in terms of an application rather than making you think about how it quote unquote works is a real benefit, because it's getting so complicated, to try to, kind of keep track. Plus, to your point, right, it's ephemeral. So you only know it for like 15 seconds and then, it's all changed again.
Yeah.
So it's very complex. And I really appreciate where kind of Kubernetes has been going around trying to, up level, kind of change how you think about it in terms of the application. So you can kind of think about the application, whereas like, when I originally started doing containers, for example, where it was all just kind of hand put together, and you lost a lot of that ephemeral benefit because you couldn't keep track of where everything was,
Yeah, for sure. Orchestration is incredibly powerful in terms of
Right.
running your application efficiently and using your resources efficiently. But it does create this kind of this ephemeral nature and the way that things can move around underneath you. You can't, as a human, keep track of that. You have to have a higher level of abstraction. And services and service mesh is getting us into that right direction. But for application developers, they absolutely shouldn't have to be thinking about what node their application is running on, or network connectivity should be kind of not the application programmer's concern.
Right. Yeah, completely agree. One of the things we like to ask every kind of guest who kind of comes on the show is, so what got you into open source, or, if Kubernetes was the first place you got into open source, what got you into Kubernetes? But really, what pulled you in about kind of the open source world? Like, why is that interesting for you?
Yeah, so I was really late to the party with open source, to be honest. So when I mentioned years ago working on SNA protocols, and I spent a lot of my early career working on proprietary networking stacks, and this was the early days of open source really, and we were quite suspicious about it. It's like, how can we have all this organization around testing and development processes and design processes, and how on earth can a community of people who don't work for each other, with no hierarchy, how on earth can that kind of turn into good development practices? And it took me years to sort of I think, in my defense, it was maturing in the world of open source as well.
Right.
It sort of magically landed with people doing great engineering, and for quite a sort of chunk of my career, I moved away from this kind of networking area. I was doing sort of consumer things and working for people like Skype, and working on music recommendations and working on TV recommendations. And then when Docker was first coming into prominence, I remember I was working on a startup, and we were in an accelerator, and the startup next to us, who had the kind of booth next to us, their CTO was getting very excited about this Docker thing. I'm like, okay, yes, maybe we should have a look at that. And that particular startup I was working on died, but I got involved in another one because, oh yeah, this containers thing, this is really interesting. We were doing container sort of auto scaling way ahead of its time, I think. And yes, seeing how much was being done open source in the containers world. I mean, I'd used some open source components before. I'd done a few little contributions here and there in various frameworks or whatever, but it was much more utilitarian, and I didn't know about the community aspect. But then getting involved in containers, I discovered there was this whole world of people who got together and had really interesting conversations and were really nice to each other. And oh, actually, this is a lot of fun. I like this world. Right, so right. That kind of, and it was also really nice to get back to kind of what I call hard tech compared to when I was doing the particularly like movie recommendations, the world of people who are not necessarily driven by tech or not necessarily driven by fact, and they want to be driven by, I don't know, the politics of how many DVDs they're selling in their particular department or something. And yeah, that wasn't me. I was much more interested in like, well, how do things work, and how do we make them work better?
Yeah, I could totally appreciate that. It was funny, like one of the drivers for me, because I used to live in Albany, New York. That's where I went to college, and and my wife, and I lived there, and we were thinking about moving, and I came to Boston, and what really convinced me about moving to Boston was actually hearing people on the street talking about tech. It was kind of like, it's the same kind of ideas, like, it's really nice sometimes to be able to be in a community where people have heard of Red Hat, right? People know what Linux is, like, and not having to kind of bring everybody up to the to the level. And I don't mind doing it, and I have lots of conversations. I mean, I'm a professor now, right? Like, I don't mind explaining the things, but it's nice sometimes to be able to have a conversation where everybody's kind of already at the same level. And I think that's one of the things that really helped, really drew me with the open source in kind of the same way you're describing. The other one I was going to mention too is just, I spent a long time as an IT consultant, right? And yeah, the fear of open source was a big deal, right? We would have to get like depending on the client, but we would have to get like individual approval, because we wanted to use Apache, things like that. It's a very different world today.
We could say it was believe it or not, it was actually in the early days of open source, it was a lot easier in the small business sphere.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Because
Yeah.
initially it was very easy to sell open source to small businesses simply because it was inexpensive.
Right. Right.
Small businesses didn't care about policy or licenses or anything. They cared about how much is it going to cost to get this piece of software.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I feel like that's kind of reversed now, right? As in the big corporations are pretty much all in on open source, even the ones who used to be proprietary software vendors. And
There's a big one
if
on the West
anything,
Coast.
small businesses are now the long tail. Because they're so dependent on antique vertical industry apps.
Yeah. Yeah. It's.
I think I'm quite maybe idealistic about how this kind of collaboration works and with the big companies. And there is some politics, and there is people are not doing it just out of entirely altruistic reasons. People, when I say people, I mean companies. They're getting involved because it's going to be good for the bottom line. But I do think it's very valuable from a collaboration, like seeing advances coming from across a group of companies they've each got a pool of very talented people, and rather than having those talented people work in isolation and build the same thing 5 times but slightly different, coming together and collaborating on it and building something like Kubernetes and all the kind of other cloud native projects surrounding it, that does sort of sing to my my desire for things to be efficient and for people to be going, let's find the best way.
Well, and kind of related, right? It also gives kind of a lot of worker autonomy, in the sense that I work on Kubernetes, right? Today I work for Red Hat, but tomorrow I could go work for some other company, because I have a relationship to Kubernetes. And so one of the things I really like about the open source community is that being a participant in it gives me autonomy from whatever company I might be affiliated with. Whereas when I was working with proprietary software, I became a really good expert in blah 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 that no one else had ever heard of, right?
Yeah.
And so it
absolutely. And
wasn't
you can't talk
transferable.
about it. Your name is not on any of the code except for in some list of blames of
Exactly.
And you can't tell anybody what you did, and even if you talked about it, nobody knows what it is.
It didn't mean anything anyway. Right. Yeah, exactly. So that, I think that's it's kind of two sides of that same coin, is it really does make a big difference to, like I said, I think it helps the developers and what I really appreciate in recent years, right, is also, it's not just developers, we're really, really trying to push that outreach to say, open source can be all the things, it's documentation, but then even things like open science and open data and, open hardware, which I think is all, really a catalyst. And it's been really good.
Absolutely. I'm involved in an organization called Open UK, which is pushing for the use of open technologies here, kind of somewhat towards government, but also, just the broader kind of industrial use in the UK. And it's not just about open source. It is about open data and open hardware and like opening things up by default, unless you have a reason not to. Which I think is a good
what is currently going on with Open UK?
Yeah, so it's a relatively new organization. I think maybe two years or so.
Okay.
And I've been really impressed with what has been done in that period of time. Currently, we've got an initiative going on called the Founders Forum, which is around encouraging people to start businesses, or if they're thinking about starting open source businesses, connecting them with folks who've got experience, because a lot of success in business is about contacts, and there are quite a few people here in the UK who have been involved in some interesting global businesses related to open source. So we want to try and connect people together. We see really good examples of this happening in Silicon Valley, Israel. There are lots of pockets of talent where people are very connected, and that's one of the things we're trying to encourage in Open UK. I've also been doing some things around sustainability. So there's a project called Patchwork Kilt, which is really about sustainable data centers and how you can improve the efficiency of your data center. If we're not telling the Googles and the AWSs and the Azures of the world how to do their data center, but more for people who are running a proprietary business, how could they make those more sustainable? So those are a couple of initiatives. A lot of it is also just about awareness and making businesses realize that open source software is
here to stay.
Real.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, I used to, when I was consulting, right, I used to do some work for like state governments. And a lot of states in the US actually have a law that require, if it's publicly funded, that it be kind of open source, in the sense that any other part of the state government can use the same software if they develop it internally. And it's like one of those things where it kind of boggles my mind, right, that any kind of state funded, and when I say state now, I mean like country or US state or whatever, like how is that not by default open source, right? Like there was a community of people who paid for this to happen. It doesn't really matter who wrote the code, and it still kind of blows my mind that there's still so much proprietary software that happens in in governments.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the data is often ours as citizens. It's collectively information about us, or it's information about our streets, our addresses. I'm not saying we should be opening up private information, but things like maps and data, it does seem to make sense that it should be open by default.
Right.
So Open UK is taking that, because I know the UK government has had this on again, off again thing with open source requirements. Like once upon a time, they were one of the first, leading countries to adopt open office or to authorize open office for departments as their productivity software. And then they reversed that after a whole lot of lobbying by Microsoft, back when Microsoft was lobbying against open source. So is Open UK taking on making that part of, because I don't know where the UK is in terms of open source requirements.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think the UK did very well, I mean, obviously my perspective is a little bit skewed from being here, but quite a few years ago now, probably 10, maybe even 15 years ago, there was a thing started called the Government Digital Service, and it predates, I think it may have been after Estonia, but probably before US. And the people who set that up, they had incredibly good vision for, like, we should be doing things open by default. We should be, and they were publishing things like their retrospectives, their sort of internal retrospectives, anonymized and taking out anything that was sensitive, but really even showing how the development process was working inside these different bits of government, website development, things like that. And the focus on usability was incredible. And a lot of the original team have moved on and gone on to do other things, but I think it really sowed this very strong seed of, the government should be building websites that people can use, and we should be using digital technology to the advantage of everyone. And you can see it in things like, our tax forms. If you want to go and renew your car tax discs thing that we have to do every year, it's really simple. Or I just did I had to pay some tax, and there was an incredibly good user experience where I was shown, logged into my account. It told me how much I had to pay. It showed me a QR code. And scan the QR code. It takes me to my bank account, fills in all the details, and says, "Do you want to make this payment to pay your tax bill?" And you don't have to type in any details, get anything wrong. It's brilliant. And that focus on usability, I think, is fantastic. And the more we can do that open source, because if that's that's a government thing, it's not anybody's commercial advantage, why shouldn't I be able to pay any other bill a proprietary build with that same technology. I hope I can. I hope we're going to see that. So
yeah. Although speaking of lobbyists, on behalf of proprietary software companies, there's definitely a lot of speculation, right, that the reason our tax law in the U.S., right, is still so complex is because of lobbying from companies like TurboTax.
It's not. I can say it's not speculation; it's documented. But
okay, all right.
I mean, as someone who briefly had to fill in some US tax, the comparison between what as a sensible human being, you can do your UK tax forms yourself. Whereas in the US, it definitely felt like we are deliberately obfuscating this so that you have to pay someone to do it. And that attitude does not seem healthy.
Right, totally.
So I did want to ask you a little bit about your role as chair of the CNCF TOC, particularly for our audience, and we're getting towards the end of our time here. Can you briefly, for audience members who know about Kubernetes and that sort of thing, have not paid that much attention to the CNCF? So let's say, the CNCF has gone from, this is the funding mechanism for Kubernetes, to this giant organization with dozens of projects. You summarize briefly what the CNCF does and what the TOC does?
It's a foundation, and it owns the IP. It acts as a neutral ground to own the IP for Kubernetes and all these other related cloud native projects. And I think although it was originally set up, Kubernetes was there and it was set up to be the foundation for Kubernetes, I think right from the get-go, it was recognized that it wasn't just going to be about Kubernetes, that there would be these adjacent technologies and projects that it would make sense to bring into the same organization. That has grown and grown and grown. Kubernetes is still very much the heart of CNCF, and the mission statement of the CNCF is about making cloud computing ubiquitous, or cloud native computing ubiquitous. So I think we've achieved a lot as a community over the last probably coming up to 5 or 6 years, I guess now, since it was created. And I think part of the success of that is that it is a community. It's got funding from and membership from all these big players and the big cloud vendors and a bunch of other proprietary software vendors who are interested in the space and have products in the space. But the attention paid to individuals and how individuals are welcomed into that community and like you were saying before about being, having agency, being able to sort of, take your value between different employers. I think that's been so constructive. I think it's been so valuable for the cloud native industry and the ecosystem. And, I don't think it's an accident that there's so much innovation and frankly money and investment in this whole cloud native space, and that ecosystem that's been created around the CNCF, I think is fundamental to that.
Just speaking to cloud native development is just for me, right? It's like so much better. It's like, this is what I've been trying to get to for quite some time. It's so much easier. I did want to kind of ask a little bit about, like, what do you feel like the TOC's role is within the CNCF? Like, what is it that they're trying to accomplish in a sense?
Yeah, so the Technical Oversight Committee was kind of created as part of the initial creation of the foundation. And the idea is really that the technical governance should be separated from the people who write the checks. And the TOC is now it's now 11 people. It was 9 when I first joined it 3 years ago. And there are limits on how many people can represent different vendors and so on. And it has representation from the governing board and from the maintainers and from the end user community. And it's really intended to, well, ensure that the projects that we bring into the foundation are cloud native, and to encourage collaboration and good interfaces between those projects. It's always good to see projects that interface with each other in a meaningful and helpful way for users. So it's supposed to be about a bar, not just for technical capabilities, but also that it's well governed, and that it is vendor. We're hoping for all these projects to be vendor neutral. And although we encourage vendors to be involved, we want that kind of nice balance between vendors who have a good commercial reason to be involved in these projects, but also don't dominate it, such that you can use Kubernetes today without paying anybody to do so. And if you have a compute platform to run Kubernetes on, you can do so. But there may be reasons why you want to pay for some value add around, and I'm just using Kubernetes as an example. So trying to make sure that there is that balance of healthy ecosystem, but that the technical bar and the projects are sound. One of the main things that the TOC does is assess the kind of maturity level of different projects between what we call sandbox, which is really early stage experimentation, through to incubation and then graduation. And when we graduate a project, we're really saying we've done a lot of due diligence in this, and this project it's really ready for everybody who is interested in cloud native
Production use, right?
Production use, yeah. And that it's been as de-risked as makes sense for use in a wide range of enterprises. So things like how stable its governance is, but also has it been used at scale, and has it been used reliably? Are there end users who are willing to come and talk to us about their experiences and tell us, it works up to, some arbitrary measure of scale for a given project. So the TOC is supposed to be, I think there's a phrase about senior engineers, and supposed to, bring some experience of seeing projects that and open source run in the real world, and kind of understanding how that landscape fits together, and kind of understanding what cloud native means, which is kind of easy at a superficial level, and then can actually turn into quite a difficult question when you're looking at a given project and saying, well, is this cloud native?
Yeah.
I'm bringing that judgment. A lot of particularly the first year, I would say, that I was on the TOC, there was a lot of pressure for the TOC to, or I think the community, completely reasonably wanted more transparency over how the TOC makes decisions. And the balance we were trying to achieve there was, well, this can't be a box ticking exercise, because if it becomes a box ticking exercise, people game that and they will just tick the boxes, but it doesn't mean to say that they really are a mature production ready project, or that they really are cloud native. So we've always had this Alexis Richardson, who was the kind of original chair of the CNCF, has a really good analogy that the TOC is like the Supreme Court, in that you're kind of making up the law, but you're making judgments, and that kind of sets precedent that go into the future. And
and I mean, in the Supreme Court analogy, it's almost as important on the judgments you don't make, or you don't take up, right? Which I think is also kind of interesting, where you kind of let's wait and see, right? We don't necessarily know if we want to make a judgment on this at this point. And I think that's also a tough call. I think what you're also kind of alluding to here, right, is this is one of those places where the experience happen, or is required, right? Is like it's very hard to articulate after, I've been doing this for 20 something years, right? It's very hard to articulate why I can look at a project and be like, that doesn't seem like it's going to go well, right? And but another one, which on the face of it doesn't seem like it's great, I can kind of dig into it a little bit and be like, oh no, there's some solid bones here. It just it needs, half the time it's there's poor communication is usually the problem, right? So I think that's I think that's kind of that senior engineer part of it, right? It's really the experience with working in a cloud native world, as you said, kind of working in the real world, right, rather than just in the abstract, really can bring to the table a good ability to judge how things should work.
Yeah.
So I know I appreciate that. I mean, that's a very hard thing to do, and especially consistently. And I think that the people who are the best at it are also the most nervous about being wrong, which
Yeah.
is also
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're aware that the decisions that we make can have a real effect on people and companies, and sometimes people are suggesting projects maybe not with completely the right motivation, but they're still individuals, and you're a little bit conscious of something that seems like an easy decision to yeah, we'll accept that into the sandbox, but it could affect people's lives. I mean, not
Right.
quite the same way that a Supreme Court affects people's lives, but it's not. We shouldn't take those decisions overly lightly, and particularly when we're talking about things like incubation, where CNCF starts funding marketing and all kinds of additional support for projects that costs money, and resources have to be spent. So fortunately, the CNCF is it's a well-funded organization, and the members, the people, the companies who are paying the fees are, I think, very supportive, and the governing board is very supportive of that breadth of project. But yeah, it's been fun. My term on the TIC is about to come to an end. I'm wrapping up after 3 years. So yeah, it's certainly been a real privilege, and I'm kind of interested to see how it evolves.
Yeah, I am not looking forward to you stepping down from the chair. You've been a phenomenal chair, and kept things moving when a lot of arguments and other things have tended to bog down. And I'm really going to miss that.
Well, I hope that we've, over the last few years, shown how it can work in a kind of constructive way. That was one of the things I really wanted to bring into it. I think there had in the past been some times where things had gotten into a bit of a sort of log jam, and you fighting about things was never going to break that log jam, and we needed to find common ground and ways to break through, and ways to get the processes moving and get more people involved to get more opinions. So yeah, I'm thank you very much for those kind words. I appreciate it. Yeah.
So kind of from the insider perspective, what are you, I hesitate to say most looking forward to, but like, what are the kind of upcoming decisions that you feel like are going to be on the table for the GOC, for the CNCF, that you're kind of most interested in, whether that's because they're good, or because they're bad, or because they're, you just don't know which way they're going to go. Can you tell us a little about what you're kind of seeing, in the pipeline?
Yeah. So one thing that I think has been kind of in the room for a while, and will continue to be in the room, is how big should CNCF be? Is there a point at which projects become too big? Not too big, or too many, if there are too many projects. And this has sort of practical knock-on effects, like how big is the KubeCon and Cloud Native Con conference, and how many projects can we afford to run security audits for, and what have you. But it also has that kind of community aspect to it, that if we get broader and broader and broader and broader and broader, do we lose cohesiveness amongst our community? I think it's totally correct that we have pockets of interest and groups of specialization within the CNCF. But that question of what is the correct balance? I will give you an example. There's been a little, I don't know why they all come at once. It's like buses, 3 come at once, of projects related to confidential computing who've applied to join the CNCF. And, at one level, this could be extremely valuable to cloud native computing and making, computing in the cloud more secure. There is also an existing confidential computing consortium within the Linux Foundation. So what's the relationship between those two organizations, and what's the right home for those projects? And how do we, get the right, how do we make that work best for everybody involved? And that's still an open question in my mind. And I think questions like that, not just, that's just an example, but for things that are certainly adjacent to cloud native and potentially could be part of cloud native, but should we be from a community perspective? I genuinely don't know the answer to that. And I think questions like that are going to keep coming up.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, kind of to your point, right? It's like, and is that line, kind of a dotted one that kind of, needs to shift over time, and whether, or how hard a line needs to be. Yeah, I could see that being a difficult question to struggle with, and something that I think, kind of for the audience, right, that's something you kind of want to pay attention to, because you need to know, like, if you want to solve confidential computing for yourself, right, as your example, right, you need to know where to go look for that. Where is the place that innovation, for lack of a better term, is happening? Where are the resources being put? Because I think that, one of the challenges as a consumer of a lot of these tools, particularly in the open source world, is, product selection, and knowing if it's one of those things that there was that old saying that, nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM, right? It's that nicety of kind of like, hey, I have my vendor lock, and while it has some downsides of vendor lock, the upside is I always know where to go get the piece I need. And in the open source world, that's much, much harder. And that's part of why we're trying to do this show too, is to try to say, hey, at least in this little pocket, we can try to help you have a sense of where these things are going, so that you have a sense of, what the right answer is to choose these things. And I think, like I said, I think part of the reason you're seeing a bunch of projects about confidential computing coming in is because it's becoming very popular, right? It's becoming a big concern for a lot of people. And so I'm sure there's a number of people who are trying to decide, I need to make a product selection sometime soon. Who's going to win, right? And where do I invest my time, energy, expertise, etc. And I know I've chosen wrong in the past, and it's a headache when you're mistaken.
Yeah. Well, mistakes will always be made.
Right. No question. It's the tolerance for change after the mistake is part of the hard part.
Yep. And with that, we're about at the end of our time here. So thank you so much for joining us, Liz, twice,
yeah.
twice, and dealing with all of the internet streaming troubleshooting that broadcasting involves these days.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts for our audience before we sign off? Yeah.
I guess I will say I really hope that we're going to actually get to do proper in-person conversations at events this year. Particularly, I'm looking forward to KubeCon, Cloud Native Con in Valencia. I'm very optimistic that is going to go ahead, and I'm dying to see people in person. That will be amazing.
Totally with you. I do want to apologize to the audience that I'm so fuzzy, but given all of our challenges from Tuesday, I decided not to muck with anything and just, one technical flaw is fine. And so hopefully we'll be better next time. But to Josh's point, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you again.
Yeah, and I hope that I get to see you in Valencia. We'll see.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much.